This is episode 178. I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and this is Conservation and Science Podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. And if you're new here, I'm always strive to bring you diverse perspectives on every environmental topic, diving into their ecological, political, and social aspects. And today, I want to recommend a book. The book is titled Why Biodiversity Matters. I think it's getting, this is in focus now. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, this is how the cover of the book looks like. Why Biodiversity Matters, written by Nigel Dudley. Nigel is a consultant ecologist, and he worked across the world. He worked everywhere in Asia, in Australia, in South America, in Europe, like everywhere. He consulted for WWF, IUCN, UNESCO, and so on and so forth. And the book is fundamentally a philosophy book where Nigel dives into the topics like biodiversity rights, nature rights, human rights, animal rights. And I like this book because it kind of summarizes all the topics that we discuss on this podcast on so many occasions, and that we discussed on social media on so many occasions, and where animal rights really works against conservation, and like what is an overlap with nature rights, animal rights, biodiversity rights, human rights, and not only where is overlap, but also where those concepts are kind of like actively working against each other. Really, really well put together book, and really thoughtful. I would, recommend, and obviously today I speak on the podcast, I talk with Nigel. So in this episode, you will have an opportunity to hear Nigel's views from the first hand, and I hope you will enjoy our conversation. And before I let you enjoy this episode, I just want to read just a first sentence from one of the chapters of the book. Okay, so here it goes. I am increasingly suspicious of certainty. One of the things that has struck me while researching this book is just how polarized and angry the debate is, full of people convinced that they have the right answer and brutally dismissive of dissent. Well, I just love this. If that's not the recommendation for this book, I don't know what would be. Once again, Why Biodiversity Matters. As always, you can buy the book in the links in the description of this show and in my newsletter. And obviously, if you buy this book through those links, you will also support my work. You will support my podcast, because I will get a tiny commission from each sale, but that doesn't change your price. Okay? So, I think that now, without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, Nigel Dudley and Why Biodiversity Matters. Nigel, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I want to start with something that you said at the very beginning of your book, that you are a conservation biologist, and you're giving all the examples from across the world. But you also say that you're not philosopher, and that book is fundamentally philosophy book that made you a little bit anxious about writing it. By the way, no anxiety here. The book is brilliant. So that good job on that. But what made you to write a philosophy? Like, what motivates you to overcome the anxiety, to overcome this and sort of take on the subject that is not entirely your cup of tea, because you're not philosopher, although the subject of biodiversity is very much right up your alley. So what was your motivation to take on the philosophical aspect of conservation biodiversity?
I think I mentioned it in the introduction that there were a series of conversations which took place within conservation organizations, within the International Union for Conservation of Nature, within a number of other big NGOs, in which people started to say, we should only focus on that bit of biodiversity which is directly supportive of humans. And that seemed to me way offline. And I've spent a lot of my career looking at ecosystem services from protected areas, looking at a whole range. We did a series of books with WWF sort of 10 years ago, looking at water benefits, at spiritual benefits, at food benefits. So I've done all that. But it just felt we were slipping back within the conservation movement to almost a sort of old-fashioned Judeo-Christian idea that nature was created for humans, or for man, actually, as they would have said. And leaders of the Jewish and Christian faiths have rejected that a long time ago. And I don't think most people outside conservation would accept that either. But I think within conservation, for a number of reasons, I saw that change. So I wanted to tackle it.
That's where the biodiversity rights idea come from. Look, so you're talking a lot about the biodiversity rights. And, I was thinking to throw the curveball at you and ask the unfair question, what are biodiversity rights? And that would be unfair because you literally wrote an entire book dealing with this. But so maybe to meet halfway, I would ask the question, what are the biodiversity rights? But maybe you can set out the context against ecosystem rights, human rights, animal rights, because I think that a lot of people, when they hear biodiversity rights, their mind automatically go into animal rights. So if you can just set a context about these four concepts.
I do a draft definition of biodiversity rights here, which I'll say, and then talk a little bit about human and animal rights. I'm saying the biodiversity rights as the right of all species to continue their natural span of existence within a functioning ecosystem. So all species go extinct. We'll go extinct eventually, or will evolve into something else. So that's fine. But what we're doing at the moment is truncating many of those options. We're driving things to extinction much more quickly. And we're also changing ecosystems so much that species no longer exist in the kind of ecosystems that they were evolved for. So I'm saying we need that's biodiversity rights. It's quite different from animal rights, which of course looks at animals and not plants. Biodiversity right looks at both plants, fungi, animals. Animal rights focuses on animals. It generally focuses on animals that look a little bit like us. It's mainly about sentient animals, and it's about individuals. And human rights obviously is about human rights. And there's a big overlap between biodiversity rights, animal rights, and human rights. But there's also quite large areas where they can clash. And that's quite a lot of the book. I'm looking at those potential clashes and what we do about that. And to go back to your earlier question, why I had a crack at a philosophy book. And several of the reviewers from the publisher said, what's this guy doing that? I'm a philosopher. Why should he be doing it? Which is a good question, actually. But I found quite a lot of the philosophy literature quite frustrating. Some of it was very good, but a lot of it was very detailed, very esoteric, and very little of it gave practical advice. Whereas I'm bumping up against these issues every day as in my work. I think every conservationist is. So I wanted to provide some practical advice where I could and ask questions and guide readers when I couldn't.
You hit the nail on the head here that philosophy should be practical. If you read like old philosophers, this is like a main thing, that philosophy is something that you're using to your daily life. That's true philosophy. There are specific, like not the books, not like somewhere, studying and not living. And this is just a side rant maybe, but I think that a lot of philosophers are not philosophers at all because they don't dealing with the lifestyle. So I would hazard to say that you are better placed to write a philosophy book because of that, because this is very, very practical. Listen, let's go back to biodiversity rights and how there can clash. So there's like a couple of interesting things. Human rights, and this is like going across the book, that human rights are part of the biodiversity rights, but there is also elements where they're clashing. So, for example, you can ask a question like, does the ecosystem or wildlife conservation is more important than people? And you gave the beautiful example in your book about tiger conservation, that if you try to introduce more tigers and grow tiger population, inevitable effect will be human casualties. So but this is like a big example, but I even recently dealt with this example kind of more close to home, Ireland or Scotland, where we said, oh, this should be all rewilded, or all the sheep should be taken out of the... But then there are communities who are living there for hundreds of years, and they're doing things there, right? It's like, oh, so now you're telling me that all what we're doing for like a generations is all shit, and we need to, I don't know, pack our stuff and go to the city. How to, like, it's not really the question, it's more of a, your comments, how you see these two things overlapping.
Well, I think we've got to try and look at both concepts, because otherwise, if you impose conservation, what we know now, if you impose conservation on a reluctant community, it won't last in the long term. And I think we've got to be very aware of exactly the kind of situation that you're talking about. I live most of the time in Wales, and I live in a sheep growing area. And actually, due to European Union funding, due to the whole structure, we've got overgrazing all over Wales. And, so there is an argument that we should be reducing the sheep. But I talked to the farmer who farms above my village, and he says, well, for him, the problem is his granddad spent his whole life clearing the land, and if he lets it go back to forest, he feels he's sort of spitting in the face of his granddad. And that's the kind of very human reaction I think we need to know about. So what we need to do, particularly in the more populated parts of the world, is very much a landscape approach, a negotiated approach, where you don't say we're going to rewild the whole of Wales, which isn't going to happen. You really negotiate how and where and when. There's very good reasons for doing that. There's good reasons, not just biodiversity, ecosystem services, things are not. But if you go in with too heavier hand, it probably won't work. And we're sort of seeing this with the EU restoration law at the moment, where there's been such huge kickback for farmers. There's lots of reasons for that, and it's not just about restoration, but if you go in too heavily, it won't work. So really need long-term negotiation. And in terms of bigger things like tigers and human-wildlife conflict, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do in terms of reducing risk and so on. Modern communication systems, modern ways of fencing, modern ways of alerting people. But you're right. It is going to be a human cost. We spent quite a lot of my partner Sue has spent a lot of the last 10 years working on tiger conservation, on improving management standards for tiger reserves around the world. And tiger numbers are going up, but more people will be killed. And, in the countries where tigers exist, there's often a fair amount of philosophical acceptance of that. But there's going to be a limit of that as well.
That must be, on occasions, I presume, weighing heavily on people doing that conservation, where it occurs like, my work, it will be direct or semi-direct reason some people will get killed.
Yeah. But it's true of lots of things. It's true of if you build a road. It's true if you build we don't tend not to think about that. It's true if you have a wood stove, if you.
Road is a good example. It's an excellent. But I am wondering, given the situation we're in right now, biodiversity collapse mainly, how do you assign weights to human rights? Here I said it, and the biodiversity rights. Let's just stay in a frame and use the terms that we're using in this podcast and in this context. I feel like, and I presume I'm not the only one, that the balance was we pushed too much in the human rights direction, and that's what is causing the collapse of the biodiversity. And maybe even saying like a human right is not really very accurate term, because it's a development, it's feeding growing population, etc., etc. But I feel like if we approach everything with negotiation, we probably not going to reverse anything, any damage that was done. So it's very hard subject. How would you And do you feel like we need to assign a little bit more weight into giving space for the ecosystem, for biodiversity to come back inevitably at some cost, at some human cost?
Yes, I think we do. But the problem at the moment is the people who have the biggest costs tend to be the people who have least. It's the people who are, the people living in a forest, the people, indigenous people. So if it was that a big industrialist had a slightly lower bonus, I'd be up for it completely. But if it's taking away from the poorest and most vulnerable, I think there is room for negotiation. We've seen a huge increase in deliberate conservation by indigenous people over the last 10, 20 years. And you can see some really quite spectacular new protected areas being set up by First Nations people in Canada, by indigenous people in Australia. And it's easy to over-romanticize that. Some people kind of assume that if you hand land back to people, it'll automatically be perfect, whereas that's not true. It could easily be that the richest, most powerful grab all the lots of things can go wrong, but it's also possible that things go right. So time-consuming though it is to go through a negotiation, I think you have to do that. I think when we're working to restore or to preserve, we've got to explain to people what we're doing. We've got to be mindful that people are going to have fears, resistance, and we've got to take time. And there's I've seen lots of practical examples in my own life of both things going spectacularly wrong when someone just bulldozed in and said, "This is what we're going to do," and things going right. Which doesn't mean that it's always going to be popular. I mean, sometimes if there's an emergency, you got to make a decision. But generally, the more you talk, the more time you take, the better it will be. And of course, that's a kind of trade-off with the urgency as well. There is this tension between the two.
And this is always like a case-by-case basis almost, right? Because this is the pitfall, like with a conversation like this one, we tend to start with general universal solutions, and there is never general and universal solution in cases like that. Another interesting thing that you talk about in your book, which ties exactly very closely to what we just talked about, are human-made ecosystems. And this is another kind of like a contentious point almost, right? For example, Heather Moorland in Scotland, right? Whether it was natural, it's a human-made, how long ago it was made by humans, right? And this is, where does it slot in? Because on one hand, it slots into human rights, and like we've been doing this, and look at that, we created now this ecosystem, which is often beneficial for some species, and then, right, like you said, someone rolls in and said like, yes, but this should be all, Atlantic rainforest or whatever else, and people go like, hey, hang on a minute, like, so you want to destroy all this? And so in your like, frame of the philosophical conversation, do human-made ecosystem are less valuable, are the same as valuable?
Very interesting question. There's actually very few ecosystems in the world that haven't been heavily modified by humans. It's not just the Scottish rainforest. We know more and more, for example, in the Amazon, that species have been moved around, that things have been managed for years. The huge sort of natural boreal forests of the far north of Canada and Russia have been deforested in the past. It's just thousands of years ago. So we have very few. So I think the question's almost irrelevant. We don't have many natural ecosystems. In Europe, most countries have less than 0.1% of what they call ancient forests. And the UN, in this case, the UN defines ancient forests as untouched for more than 200 years. So it's not even really that ancient compared to the Pacific Northwest, Biologisty in Poland is one of the very, very few. There's some way north in Finland and Sweden and Norway. There's tiny other fragments. So, we're talking about a massively altered system. I don't think that's a problem. We just have to, and the fact that we've taken out the mega carnivores from many of our ecosystems means that we can't walk away and expect to maintain the same ecosystem. The rewilding lobby would like to reintroduce species to try and mimic those predators. I mean, we've got a debate about lynx in the UK, which I think bringing lynx in would be very good, because we have a massive problem with regeneration of woodland because we have too many deer. We have too many deer because we don't have any wolves and bears. So unless there's two options, we go out and shoot the deer, or we have lynx. I'd much rather have lynx, but there's a limit to that. In the past we would have had our own species of elephant. We'd also have mammoths in the UK. So Britain wouldn't be a vast forest. It would be a little bit like, I assume, it would be a little bit like the savannah in Africa, where elephants will knock down trees all the time and open up areas, and elephants will take out a tree because they can get a certain chemical from the root, or just because if they're in a bad mood, they'll knock down a tree. You can see them doing it. I've seen them doing it. So rewilding is exciting, and I think there's lots of interesting things we can do. But from a biodiversity rights perspective, if we want to maintain as many species as possible in a lot of the world, we have real challenges, because we've lost a cohort of species, probably due to us. I mean, it's still not proven. It might have been the Ice Age. It might have been humans, probably humans. Certainly humans killed off the mammoth.
There are problems like, for example, predator control, which are, connected in my head to human-made ecosystem. You have a human-made ecosystem, and you have a certain species, and you don't want those species to go over the edge. But also your modified ecosystem created conditions that are super conducive to, those mesopredators that are all of a sudden overabundant. And I heard two views on this subject. One was obviously more popular, that no, we created this mess, and now we are part of this ecosystem. It's a human-made ecosystem. Human is a factor, a controlling factor. Therefore, we go and we control mesopredators, which to me sounds like it's like a little bit too much responsibility on a human who created that ecosystem to also keep it, to not go over the edge. But I also heard opinion from ecologist whose book I reviewed, and he was on the podcast as well, that these overabundant mesopredators and all, this is just the way nature tries to rebalance itself. And, once, just leave it. And because you have no chance of rebalancing ecosystem, only nature can do it. And if, your curlew or some other wading birds go extinct, then tough. But this is which is I hard find to reconcile that. So I'm wondering, where and that maybe leads to the bigger question, if we are moving forward and if we accepting the human impact on the ecosystem and the new ecosystems that are created by humans. I don't want to put any more words in your mouth, so you can just develop that in a second. Should we let some species to go extinct in that case?
Really complicated one. This actually goes back to a book I wrote about 12 years ago, I guess, called Authenticity, in which I tried to look at what naturalness means in a world where there actually isn't anything natural. And I used the word authenticity to try and give a different pitch on it. And I won't go through all that but what I was trying to say there was that the idea of a functioning ecosystem that is in balance is still really important, even in a world where we've made big changes. I would say, as much as possible, we should be moving towards a situation where the ecosystem we live in is in balance, and we shouldn't be the perpetual stewards. It shouldn't be our role. But nor do I think it's right to just walk away and leave it to rebalance itself, because we will lose a lot. It's a very good question. I don't have a total answer, but my instinct is that we should spend some effort maintaining things like curlews and golden plovers and things that are being destroyed by the fact that we've got an abundance of mesopredators. So I'm not in the school of just turning our back and walking away, but I do think we should be planning a process by which our role becomes less over time.
As usual, the real question is, what is the proportion of each, and what is the balance, right? How we get that thing. So all these you mentioned the natural ecosystems and balanced ecosystems. You have a section in your book that really, I liked it a lot. It really struck the chord when you're saying like the natural ecosystems, the concept of natural ecosystem needs a rebuild. And you, for example, bring an example that we tend to focus on, some endemic species, that there's like some species living in only one place. There's like a very few specimens left, and that gets like a financing, and people just, let's save, X. And then your argument is like, well, yeah, but in the grand scheme of things, that thing doesn't really matter. Which is, I think, very brave positions that you take, because I'm sure there's a lot of people, especially involved in conservation of those species, who are just be like immensely angry. But I like that concept. I like the kind of like a pragmatic approach almost. So, and this is why this is like such a great book, because you have this aspect of like a pragmatic approach, but also like a philosophical consideration on this. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that idea of the rebooting the concept of natural ecosystem?
I think there's two things that are important here. First of all, going forward, this is only we need a huge societal effort, and we have to listen to we have to listen to what people want to work on. So you'll find that people get, even if a species is evolutionary irrelevant, if someone's really interested in it and they want to put time into it, then we need to respect that. Things like red squirrels, actually, a lot of money spent in the UK on maintaining the red squirrel against the invasive grey squirrel. And red squirrels are common everywhere else in Europe. I mean, actually, it doesn't make sense from a biodiversity point of view. But people love red squirrels, and it's very important from the spirit of people living in those areas. People are proud if they live in areas with red squirrels. So you've got to listen to that. And then additionally, I think connected to that, one of the things we don't do enough as conservationists is really look at species across their whole range. I think that's what you were talking about when I talked about it in the book. So, we spend we put a lot of effort into maintaining the swallowtail butterfly in the UK, or maybe things like the wryneck, which have now disappeared, but actually they're common. You see them everywhere in the rest of Europe. They were always on the edge here and in the UK, and now they're being pushed out. And I would say, who cares? That doesn't matter. I mean, the third thing to really think about here is we're in a very, very rapidly changing climate. And so the whole idea of natural is going to change, is already changing. It's changing in my lifetime. Things are moving. Things are coming under stress. Ecosystems are changing. So what we can't do as conservationists anymore is try and necessarily always keep something as if a kind of theoretical baseline that this is how it's always been. First of all, it probably isn't. Things change over time, but we've accelerated that process. So we have to look at what are called novel ecosystems, new ecosystems that will emerge both because of climate and because of the number of things we've moved around the world, the number of invasive species, which in real terms we can't get rid of. So we have to live with them.
So how do you reconcile that with another concept introduced, and you talk about, maybe not introduced, but you talk about in the book, there's this question like, are all the animals equal then? Do we have like a better animals? And because there are a number of, and this is why I like the book so much, because you touch on all those things that I was kind of like considering without even thinking that this is like a philosophy, right? But it's like Hunter says like, oh, you care about this because it has eyelashes, right? Nobody gives a crap about snails, but people are upset about charismatic megafauna. People are not upset, like vegans are slapping mosquitoes all day long, right? And even though, like you said, like, oh, like animal rights, like plants are excluded from animal rights. So and I'm struggling how to ask the question, because you almost like not answering the questions, you just considering the possible answers. So I'm just curious of your considerations on this subject, like how to reconcile, like on one hand, like should everything be equal? Should the snail matter as much as an elephant, or maybe something in the middle of the pyramid that is not that important versus the snails or dung beetles that are super important for the ecosystem? Or how even to begin to think about it?
How do we make those choices? Well, the definition I talked about talks about the right of all species. So in theory, absolutely, all species are important. In practice, we're going to have to use a triage approach in many cases. We're not going to be able to save everything. Things are changing. So I think we should move away from, but maybe some of the very important species, what we call the keystone species, won't be the most obvious ones. They're going to be particular species of fungi. They're going to be particular soil organisms. They're going to be particular plants. So I think our attention tends to be really skewed at the moment. It tends to be, as you say, things with eyelashes, things that look cute. That's what people get excited about. Things that look like us to some extent. And we need to move away from that. So in theory, yes, everything is important. In practice, we're going to have to be selective, but we need to be selective in terms of the species that are most important are those that have a big impact on lots of other species that keep an ecosystem functioning. An individual, I use the example of and it's about animal rights and human rights, but I use the example of a plant that's only found on one island offshore of California, and a lot of money was spent killing rabbits in order to preserve that plant. And I used it as an example that was sort of animal rights people would say that's crazy. Biodiversity rights people would say that makes sense. And I'm on the school of saying that makes sense. But that plant is not going to make any difference to the stability of the global ecosystem, because it's just on this one little island. So, perhaps it is important, but it's not as important as maybe something that is influencing a huge area of the Cerrado, of the Amazon, or the Congo Basin.
I agree. I agree with the idea of let's focus our efforts where it matters the most. The problem with that approach is that it seems like we still don't know all the impacts and all the interactions of the Amazon. Not long ago, I interviewed a scientist. They published an excellent paper where an invasive species of ants that lives on trees modified the way lions hunt and modified the way they hunt zebras and change the prey, and elephants are included into that. And this is just like the tiny species of ants. And when I was talking to him, he goes like, this is only possible because we have all these data sets, all these scientists just by a chance connected the dots. And it's like, so are we not running the risk that we're gonna focus, like we're gonna, again, like a very anthropocentric, like we deem this thing valuable and we think that this thing is a corner species, and that like all those things, like, oh, screw them. And then it turns out that there's like, oh, too late. They were very important. How we deal with that risk? Because I agree with you that you cannot spread yourself too thin, right? You're just like, let's protect everything now. That's not going to happen either.
No, it's a very good point. And there's no easy answer to that. We will make mistakes. Once we've recognized it, we know there's going to be other keystone species or other really important species, very influential species, which we're continually identifying, we're continually looking at. And that's why, on the whole, conservationists like to preserve ecosystems. They like to preserve big areas where a functioning ecosystem can continue. Because there's all sorts of stuff happening in there which we don't know yet. We won't know for hundreds of years. There's still so much to learn. So I think the safe way, the way to maintain insurance is to maintain big ecosystems. And focusing just on keystone species can be very dangerous. I mean, in Sweden, 20, 30 years ago, the forest management was based on timber supply and on maintaining moose, which was really important for the diet of many people. They were allowed to shoot a moose a year, and that was a lot of your meat. And people were poor in the north and so on. But it missed all the deadwood associated species. It missed a whole bunch of things. So if you get your indicators wrong, it can pull your management in the wrong direction. Lots of attention on orangutans, quite rightly in places like Borneo. But actually, as long as there are fruit trees, orangutans don't need a very balanced ecosystem. As long as there's stuff for them to hang out and eat fruit, they'll be happy. They're probably the wrong species. So to answer your question, I think we need to be much smarter about the indicators we choose when we're planning conservation. And it's not just the biggest and the most obvious. In fact, it's often not them, because they're the intelligent ones that can use substandard ecosystems. There was around one of the big national parks in South Africa, there were masses of eucalyptus plantation. And the company actually, good on them, they took a lot of it out and they restored savanna. So there's now just a narrow strip around. But actually all the zebras go and hang out there during the day because it's nice and cool, That's where you see them. You don't see them out in the restored area. So using a zebra as a indicator would be wrong in that case. As long as they got grass and somewhere to shelter, they'll be quite happy. It's often the things which are much less obvious, much more sensitive, much more fragile that we need to be measuring. We need to be looking at.
It really reminded me of nightingale. I think it was nightingales, but in general, that we tend to focus on restoring habitat for a species that was the place when they were last seen. And then it's like, well, but this is not their preferred habitat. This is just the last refuge where they hang on. It's like, don't restore that. They need something else. What's your take on the concept of historic range? I sometimes just, not comfortable when university-trained ecologists are bringing arguments when it comes to conservation or restoration of species of the historic range. Because and this is again, maybe just a point of entry for the wider conversation of the risk, sometimes not on purpose that we're running, of picking an arbitrary point in time and saying like, this is gold standard. We restoring to this point. And you even mentioned that in this podcast that the sometimes things are changing, and even like a biggest boreal forest at some point were deforested, and at some point it was something else. So when we talk about restoration, nature restoration or conservation, it's like how to deal with the situation. Like the ecosystem by its very definitions are moving, they're changing. There's not like one thing. And how one finds the balance between like, putting a finger on the time scale as like, yep, that was the, golden years for wolves. Therefore, this is what we should aim for. Versus like, wolves are doing like in Europe, they're doing much better than they did for the last 30 years. Maybe that is a new standard and we don't need to, recover them anymore and so on. Like how to even begin to deal with that?
I'm not a big fan of historic range. First, because it's in many parts of the world, it's quite a racist concept. I mean, we talk about in any of the places where Europeans colonized, we say when we arrived, that's a baseline. For a long time, that's changing, but certainly until 10, 20 years ago, that's a baseline. Like the people who lived there before were irrelevant. And a lot of indigenous people hate the concept of wilderness because wilderness is the place they've lived in, for centuries and often modified. So, but people who like the concept of wilderness don't want to lose the word. We've had long debates about that. So historic range, I think, is dangerous from a social point of view. It's kind of increasingly irrelevant because of climate change and things are changing very quickly. And it's also often irrecoverable because things have changed so much. We're not going to get the historic range of the tiger back again. I mean, one of the interesting things about tiger conservation is that none of the countries that have lost tigers actually want them back again. So South Korea, and I've worked in South Korea a lot, they've got an interesting and I think very impressive national park system. They've done a lot of restoration of the sun bear, of natural forest structure, of things like that, but they're not talking about the tiger because it would be socially so difficult to get it back. The first person killed would be the government would fall. So I think historic range is a little bit irrelevant because it's racist, because it's changing, and because it's also just practically impossible until perhaps in the future the world population human population will shrink, in which case we can do all kinds or those people around them will be able to do all kinds of interesting things, but not at the moment.
It's gonna be new historical range. Yeah, that's a thing that it's best when the animal like comes back on its own devices. Again, something that was mentioned in this podcast like so many times, like someone reintroduces, which is like, I don't like the term because it doesn't make sense to me, but like restores, let's say, an animal, whether it's a wolf or tiger, then the perception is like, now that is your tiger. And whatever it does, it's your fault, rather than like war.
We see some quite interesting reintroductions. Goshawks. In the UK, goshawks are gone. They've been shot out by gamekeepers. They were reintroduced sort of clandestinely, as far as I can see. But now, they're spreading out again. They're coming back. It can work.
Yeah. On a non-controversial species, it's always problem with these controversial species. And the other thing is like, there's like so few uncontroversial species. He's like almost whatever you touch, whether it's a beaver or wolf, like it's all controversial. But anyway, I have to ask you for one other thing, and you mentioned also rewilding. I like how you frame rewilding in your book. That you frame that in the context of the rights to exist in the functioning ecosystem, where it is not about one or another species, right? Like I hate this code, like, you're gonna rewild wolves. It's like, no, wolves are already wild. You don't need to rewild. You don't need to rewild them. It's more of a whole entire ecosystem. And then not long ago, I had an episode about rewilding. What I took out from this conversation is actually how I understand rewilding. This is like a landscape scale. Now you talk about landscape scale, then obviously people living on the landscape are just understandably so are going to upset or anxious or just hate the term. In the concepts of biodiversity rights, ecosystem rights, where do you place rewilding? And do you even, in the context of everything that we said about novel ecosystem and so on, do you think that the concept of rewilding is even helpful? Is it like a nice, proxy or nice term to use, but really, word for word and action for action is not helpful or useful even? Where would you place rewilding in that puzzle jigsaw?
It's a really complicated one. It's been really inspirational for a whole cadre of people, and even in a country like the UK or other European countries that have been very heavily modified, it's very heartening to see that even a few years you'll see species coming back, with the right. So I think it's great in that it's shown the potential for restoration. I'm not sure rewilding is actually different from good restoration. I don't think it is. I think I maybe made that point in the book. But the flip side of that is that it's now got it's got a knee-jerk reaction from a whole other group of the population. So in our village in Wales, we had signs at both ends of the village saying no rewilding here, because there was a plan to rewild from the mountain of Plynlimmon, which is the source of the River Severn, so the big, right down to the sea. And it was in theory, a very cool project, but a number of things went wrong. The organisation that was doing it told local people they weren't interested in rewilding wolves ever, but then on their website they said there were. So everyone's worried about wolves. And then, this is fascinating, then some of the money came from New Zealand. And there's huge concern among Welsh farmers that New Zealand lamb will outcompete Welsh lamb. And so in the farming press, they said this is a conspiracy by New Zealanders to undermine our farming, which it isn't. I mean, it's irrelevant. But then suddenly it's a huge deal. It's a big deal. And then, to their credit, the one group just left. But then a whole bunch of other groups did that. They brought in farmers into the discussion, and now they've got a process which is going slower, but is happening and is supported. And I think that's what I meant when we talked earlier. You've got to take time. You've got to talk to people. You've got to bring them with them. So to answer your question, whether rewilding is the right term, I honestly don't know. It works for some people, but it's also very controversial. And funnily enough, the signs we had saying conservation, yes, rewilding, no. Now, actually, rewilding is conservation, but it's a trigger term. We've got to be quite careful with it.
Yeah, exactly. Toxic, even.
Yeah.
Like some say. Do you think though that we brought here, because here's two things. We brought the indigenous communities, people, very poor people who often living with the dangerous animals, getting killed on daily basis by those dangerous animals and so on. And I'm just gonna skip for a moment that very often these are the people in our mind they should be the ones who are protecting animals and so on, right? The whole trophy hunting discussion and so on, which is completely separate podcast, probably. You don't even want to go there. But then we have like you mentioned, farmers opposing biosphere reserve because they're afraid that this is going to, restrict what they can do, it will limit their operations and so on. And then they often bring or sort of try to piggyback on this argument of indigenous people and, this is all racist and so on. I feel like this is disingenuous on many occasions because it's hard to compare, modern age farmer in Europe with all his machinery and all that stuff, albeit probably on their loan and not owning, with people who are owning a stick and a bowl, and say like, oh, this is the same, mechanism you try to dispossess us, and like, where to on the other hand, these people who are living there, those modern farmers, they have legitimate concerns as well, right? I'm not trying to dismiss that in the slightest.
No, I think the farming community is very complicated. It's going to change. A lot of people are going to go broke. I mean, that's the reality. Particularly, I mean, it's interesting. Throughout Europe, Britain, Brexit was disastrous for farmers. 2/3 of the farmers in Wales voted for Brexit, but on the rather naive belief that the government was going to give the same amount of money than the Europeans had. It would just, there was a big misunderstanding. No, of course they're not the same. They've got all kinds of social checks and balances that are not in place for the poorest people of the world. It is disingenuous, but you've also got to recognize that on the one hand, there's a whole group of people that are now feeling very under pressure. The prices they're paid are very much controlled by the big food industry, the dairy industry. They're not getting a proper amount of money for their goods anymore. So they're having to flog the land more and more in order to try and make that up. I think they also often get I see the farmers around me spending money on big kit that honestly, if I was doing that farming, I wouldn't have. I think there's lots of peer pressure so you can spend a lot of money on a big fancy new. The guy above me has a big fancy new tractor. I looked it up. It's about £50,000. It's huge. You still got a house for me around that cost, and he really only uses it to knock down a bit of bracken and to move manure into the fields, and you could hire something, but there's all kinds of pressures to spend money and to be high tech. Sorry, that's a bit of a rambling answer. I think farmers are feeling very under pressure. I think they're kicking back. I think they're using arguments that don't always hold water, but I just think there's a lot of fear out there.
No, you're right. This is like so many overlapping issues. One, like you mentioned, I think that's my personal opinion, that we in our culture, Western culture, we just have crappy values. But we just don't value the things that should be valuable. Listen, Nigel, to wrap this up, if you had a crystal ball, this is like a famous crystal ball question. Like, how do you see, ecosystems, biodiversity on this planet playing out in the future for, next 30, 50, 100 years? How do you see that? Is it all going to be, very simplified ecosystem of, jellyfish and worms, and maybe rats? Or is there a realistic chance of, recovering, having more biodiversity than we have right now?
I think there's everything to play for. If I didn't think that, I wouldn't be doing this. I'd be walking the mountains and having fun. And I think as I said, where rewilding is really interesting is it shows that even over sort of 10, 20 years, you can make a big difference. It is possible to restore. Things are going to be simplified. We are losing species. Many of them we don't know about. Many of them are unknown species, and we're losing genetic potential. We're losing things, but very, very hard to look at a crystal ball and depend what happens politically. Politics are horrible at the moment. More and more of the world is being controlled by, in effect, dictatorships or certainly deeply undemocratic processes. Underneath that, stuff is still happening, and it's interesting that even some of the apparently least sympathetic governments actually still will put money and time into conservation. I think where we sit on climate change is going to make a big difference, and it's interesting to see a slow shift, even in countries like America, where The Republican Party seems to have just nailed its colours to the mast of saying climate change isn't happening, which is very bizarre. But more than half of the US believe it is now. And that's going to keep on shifting as they get more climate shifts. Same things are happening in Australia, again, where you've had a very resistant government. So there'll be ebbs and flows. There'll be losses and gains. No, I still remain optimistic. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't.
That's good to hear, Nigel. And I noticed that a lot of people who are just have a similar sentiment, like, I'm optimistic. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing that. Folks, Why Biodiversity Matters by Nigel Dudley. The link's in the description of the show, as usual. You can go in there, buy the book. It's a excellent book and well worth reading. Nigel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.